Welcome into the Still Curtain podcast on this beautiful Monday afternoon. I'm coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it's 16 days until the Pittsburgh Steelers will report to training camp in Latrobe, PA. It was a long holiday weekend for everybody, a long 4th of July weekend, which is great, by the way. 4th of July should fall on a Thursday and give us like a long Thanksgiving-esque weekend every year. That was fantastic. But that long weekend, everyone, most of us anyways, were drinking our six packs while the Pittsburgh Steelers quarterbacks, they were showing theirs off. Some workout photos from Russell Wilson and Justin Fields both surfaced, and let's just say one's looking a little bit better than the other. But that gave me the idea to give you a Steelers offseason six pack of my thoughts about everything going back to the very beginning of this offseason, even before the draft. And we'll get into some free agency stuff and just my thoughts about the team in this offseason as we're still stuck in this dead period before we'll get some news coming out of training camp and everything in just over 2 weeks. That leads me to the number one story of the Steelers offseason, and really the number one thing on this list for good reason. Russell Wilson is on his third NFL team. The Super Bowl winning quarterback is trying to recapture his old glory, find his form again as that near MVP caliber, near Hall of Fame caliber quarterback, which he still could be. So that made me think, how many Super Bowl winning quarterbacks have ended up bouncing around this much? And I dug into it. There are 34 different Super Bowl winning quarterbacks. 12 of them, and now Russell Wilson will be the 13th, have played on more than two teams in their NFL careers. Of that group, 4 quarterbacks have played on exactly 3 teams, and 8 quarterbacks have played on 4+ teams. So I'll give you the list to start things off. It's Len Dawson going all the way back to, I believe, Super Bowl III. Ken Stabler, Jim Plunkett, Jim McMahon, Jeff Hostetler, Mark Rippon, Brett Favre, Kurt Warner, Trent Dilfer, Brad Johnson, Joe Flacco, Nick Foles, and now Russell Wilson. That's an interesting group of guys. 4 of them are Hall of Famers. That's Dawson, Stabler, Favre, and Warner. And there's a lot of journeymen, if you will, scattered throughout that group as well. Dawson's kind of a unique case. He was actually on the Steelers and the Browns before he ended up in Kansas City and found his footing in his career. He never started for the Steelers. Players like Trent Dilfer, on 5 teams, Brad Johnson on 4 teams, Nick Foles on 6 teams, and that was kind of a capturing lightning in a bottle type of situation. Russell Wilson is more in the group with Len Dawson, Ken Stabler, Brett Favre, and Kurt Warner, the 4 Hall of Famers from that list. And Wilson likely will be a Hall of Fame quarterback, I would imagine. The end of his career is certainly not helping that case, but he was in the mix for multiple MVP awards and took the Seahawks back to the Super Bowl after winning it in such an emphatic fashion. The story is the 3rd round pick. That helps his case somewhat as well. So we'll just look at him along with those 4 guys. And the best example really is Ken Stabler's career. That's the closest comparison. I talked about Dawson. His career was weird. He played on 4 teams, the Steelers, the Browns, his first 5 years, and then only had 2 starts in his first 5 seasons. Then he settled in with the Chiefs from 63 to 75. So that's really the bulk of his career. Not the same thing. Brett Favre, obviously he was an MVP in 2009 and was 4th in the MVP in Minnesota in 2009 is what I was getting at. So he, recaptured things and was one of the best quarterbacks in the league on his 3rd team. After 1 year with the Jets, and it was kind of a down year. And then obviously the concussion in the playoffs against the Saints, the Bounty Gate situation, that kind of ended his career. Favre's on a different level than Wilson it's not so applicable. And Warner's a completely different situation, an undrafted quarterback. He found his footing with the Rams and the greatest show on turf, went to the Giants for a season, and then had 5 years with the Cardinals. So that second act was a great one for him. He got to Arizona younger than Wilson is getting to Pittsburgh, and with a lot more hope for his career than Wilson's. Not a ton. That down year in New York was a legitimate down year, and people thought it was the end for Warner, but it's not as close a comparison as it is for Stabler. So we'll look at Ken Stabler's career because this is the likely trajectory for a player like Russell Wilson, who's trying to recapture that Super Bowl form after winning the Super Bowl. And Steelers fans are wondering how likely that is. So this is the first example. In 74, Stabler was the MVP, Offensive Player of the Year. That was his 5th season and his 2nd as the starter. So a lot of success very early for Stabler. 26 touchdowns, 12 interceptions that year, 2,500 passing yards in 74. That's great. 76, 3rd in the MVP, a career high, 103.4 passer rating. And at 31 years old, he wins the Super Bowl. 27 touchdowns, 17 interceptions that year, 9.4 yards per attempt. Was excellent in his Super Bowl year, as Russell Wilson was. Got some help from a very talented team around him. Stabler wasn't the Super Bowl MVP, I don't believe, that year. I believe it was Fred Biletnikoff in 76. And then by 1980, Stabler is traded to Houston for Dan Pastorini after making the AFC title game. So Wilson was still at a pretty high level in Seattle when they traded him. And the Raiders didn't get as much for Stabler as Seattle did for Wilson, but trading draft picks was not as common and certainly not in the quantity that we see now. So Stabler started for 2 years in Houston, a 68.5 passer rating in 1980, 13 touchdowns, 28 interceptions, an 11-5 record, so still a decent team, and then a 69.5 passer rating in 1981, 14 touchdowns, 18 interceptions, 5-7 record, and he gets cut. Sounds a little bit like the 2 years in Denver for Russell Wilson, except flipped, because Wilson's second year was a little bit better, but that albatross of a contract led him to be cut and the Broncos to take the largest dead cap hit in NFL history. So Stabler then gets to New Orleans in 1982 at the age of 37. Russell Wilson right now is 36. In 82, it was a shortened season. The Saints went 4-4. Stabler, 6 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 71.8 rating. Better than he was in Houston, but not good enough. And 83, 7-7. 9 touchdowns, 18 interceptions, 61.4 rating. And he stayed with New Orleans as a backup the next year, but his career was effectively over. And that's worrisome. I mean, it's just one example. Obviously, it's anecdotal evidence, but that's worrisome for the trajectory of Russell Wilson's career because it's laid out almost exactly the same. And Stabler was not able to recapture his previous glory. The Raiders went on actually to succeed and win another Super Bowl with Jim Plunkett after he replaced Pastorini, who broke his leg. It feels like that's the version of Russell Wilson we're going to get in Pittsburgh. We're going to get the third act that's maybe a little better than the second, but it's also only considered better because the expectations were lower, and that certainly helps things out. I don't think there's a good chance that Russell Wilson looks like a Super Bowl winning quarterback this year. And the history of the quarterbacks that play on 3 or more teams that have won a Super Bowl, it's not great. It's a lot of guys who won with defense. And that's an argument you hear often about Wilson and those Seattle teams. It's a lot of guys who won with a great supporting cast, like Wilson had in Seattle. He was a great quarterback for a few years after the Legion of Boom teams for the Seahawks, but we didn't see a great quarterback in Denver, and I don't think we're going to see a great quarterback in Pittsburgh in 2024. That brings us to number 2 in the 6-pack. The Pittsburgh Steelers could have the best offensive line in football. Maybe not this year, but pretty soon. This is a gargantuan investment in offensive line by Omar Khan and Andy Weidel. Two of the biggest free agent signings of the last couple of off seasons for the Steelers, Isaac Seumalo and James Daniels. They're investing on the interior. And then drafted Broderick Jones. Now you draft Troy Fautanu and you draft Zach Frazier. You have first-round picks as the bookends. You have a second-round pick in the middle who's a ready-made pro second-round pick. And heavy investment at the guard spot. And Daniels may leave as a free agent this offseason, or he'll command a pretty hefty price tag, but they drafted Mason McCormick to replace him. And McCormick is an athletic freak that they got in the later rounds out of a smaller school and could be that kind of Andy Weidel steal that we saw for so many years in Philadelphia. And that made me think, what does the best offensive line in football get you? When Jim Harbaugh took over the Chargers again this year, there was a lot of talk about offensive line because it was almost assumed that LA would take an O-lineman at number 5 instead of a receiver, even though they need receivers for Herbert. They went with Joe Alt to go opposite Rashawn Slater to have great bookend tackles like the Steelers have now. And Harbaugh talked a lot about offensive linemen are weapons. They're the only position on the field that doesn't rely on any other position group to be successful. They create their own success. And having that foundational piece, well, what does that get you? What does maybe the best offensive line in the NFL actually get you? Because that's what the Steelers could have just built. If Broderick Jones and if Fautanu work out and if Zach Frazier works out, because there is also a tendency, and I'm falling into this trap, of assuming that a first round offensive lineman is just going to be great, where other positions you question that a lot more. And there's some proof to the fact that offensive linemen do receive second contracts at a much higher rate, but it's not 100%. So if Jones and Fautanu and Frazier all work out, and we know Seumalo and Daniels or say McCormick work out at right guard, this could be one of the best offensive lines in football. What does that get you? Well, in 2023, arguably the best lines were either the Eagles or the Lions. And the Eagles fell apart. They still ended up 11-6. They were bounced in the divisional round. And we saw what the Lions did. They nearly took it to the 49ers in the NFC Championship. There was a moment there where Jared Goff was going to get Detroit to the Super Bowl after the Eagles got to the Super Bowl in 2022. In 2022, Philadelphia absolutely had the best offensive line. 14-3 Super Bowl loss with Jalen Hurts is still a young, unproven quarterback at that point. Going into 2022, I feel like we forget this now. Hurts was somebody that Philly was maybe looking to upgrade over. There was talk about the Eagles potentially making a run at a more higher profile quarterback going into the 2022 season, and that was a make or break year for Hurts. Obviously, he made it. He was excellent and was, other than a fumble, fantastic against Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. In 2021, the best offensive line going back, there were a couple good ones. The Cowboys kind of seemed to jump out looking at some PFF metrics, and people don't love PFF metrics, but I'm not going to grind all the 2021 tape. I'll take their word for it mostly in terms of the entire group and looking at some of the rushing numbers. That was a good group. They went 12-5, Dallas, and lost in the wild card round. That's a fairly good floor, and it seems like that's kind of close to the floor. In 2020, it was the Browns. Joel Bitonio, Wyatt Teller at the guard spots, they were great, and there was still some hope for the tackle position in Cleveland at the time, and that was a great running game with Nick Chubb. The Browns went 11-5, beat the Steelers in the wild card round. We remember that. They did that with Baker Mayfield, who they cast aside pretty soon thereafter. And we saw Mayfield have success behind a good line in Tampa Bay this year, but Mayfield is not a generational talent at quarterback that's just carrying a team. It seems like an offensive line can kind of do that for you, even if you have a question mark at quarterback like the Steelers do. 2019. That year was weird, and there are multiple different offensive lines that kind of jump out as one of the best. The Eagles, again, obviously, they had that foundation with Kelsey and Lane Johnson and all the different great players, Mailata at left tackle. They went 9-7, won the division, weren't a great team. That was the Carson Wentz kind of transition year. The Ravens went 14-2. They were in the mix as the best offensive line. They were the best rushing team in football that year. They won the division title, obviously. And the Saints, who had a really good group, that was back when Ryan Ramczyk was healthy and things looked a lot better for New Orleans. They went 13-3 with an aging Drew Brees. That was a very talented roster, and they were pretty all in on those teams. But these are the best offensive lines in football, and that even gives you a better sample of like maybe the three best. And the floor seems to be 9-7 with the division title. 2018, the Colts, they had Quentin Nelson, and he was kind of revitalizing that line. They had invested very heavily in it because they believed that Andrew Luck was going to be around for a while, and they finally needed to protect him after a lot of injuries. They went 10-6, won the division title, beat the Texans in the wild card round, and lost to the Chiefs in the divisional round. 2017, that was the Steelers. That line was fantastic. Villanueva, Foster, Pouncey, DeCastro. I believe that was before Filer at right tackle. It was a great group. They went 13-3, lost in the divisional round. We know what happened, but it wasn't the offense's fault. That's kind of the area that the Steelers could be in pretty short order because of this offensive line investment, and I love the job that Omar Khan and Andy Weidel have done with it. And before we get to number 3 in the six-pack, I got to tell you about DraftKings. Hey, Steelers fans, DraftKings is offering a fantastic sign-up bonus for new users. New customers can place a $5 first bet on any sport to instantly claim $150 in bonus bets when you sign up with our code FSBETS. The best part is that you will receive your rewards even if your first bet loses. Using our code FSBETS not only gets you these bonuses, but it also directly supports our podcast. If you've been considering signing up for DraftKings, make sure to use the code FSBETS. That's FSBETS to maximize your first bets. This offer is only available to new customers who are 21 plus and physically present in legal gambling states. Please remember to always gamble responsibly. Check out the episode description for the full terms of the offer to see if you qualify. And now that's going to bring us to an offseason storyline that really never came to fruition for the Steelers. I don't think the Steelers need to trade for a wide receiver. And I didn't really talk about this because I didn't see a very realistic trade out there. The Courtland Sutton one seemed the most plausible to me, reuniting him with Russ and getting him out of Denver. Denver's kind of in this rebuilding phase. They're doing it with a heavy dead cap hit, so maybe they'd want to add some more picks. That hasn't happened. I don't think it will. The Brandon Ayuk deal, he wants to get out of San Francisco, or at least he wants to flex his muscles and use as much leverage as he can to try to convince San Francisco that he should be traded. That never made any sense to me. Ayuk's on the 5th-year option in 2024 for $14.1 million. They could tag him in 2025 if they want. Brock Purdy's extension kicks in 2026, so they'll still have a cheap quarterback. And if they want to tag him, it'll probably be around 21.8. That might jump some with the massive wide receiver contracts, but it still won't be like on that upper echelon in the 30s for an AAV. It's a good deal for a true number 1 wide receiver, which Ayuk is. It seems like the 49ers value Deebo Samuel's versatility more, but they're not going to just move off of Ayuk, who's their best outside receiver in a championship window when they have a quarterback on the cheapest contract in the NFL and are allocating almost no resources to that position because Purdy was the last pick in the draft. It would likely take a second-round pick, but probably more to get Ayuk. And for the Steelers' perspective, teams without a quarterback should not be trading away those type of premium picks. The Steelers have 3 possible paths to a franchise quarterback, and none of them really include trading for another wide receiver when George Pickens is your number 1 and you're in a more run-heavy offense with Arthur Smith, the three options, draft one. Simple as that. And you could try to do it with your pick near the 20s because you have Mike Tomlin as your coach and you're never going to be much further down than that. Sometimes that's Kenny Pickett. Sometimes it's better than Kenny Pickett, but sometimes it's Kenny Pickett. So you either need the pick to make that selection or you need more picks to trade up and make the selection you actually want to make more. The other options, you trade for one and you need to overwhelm a team with picks. It's a quantity game when you're trading for a franchise quarterback. The Russell Wilson trade to Denver, that took 5 picks, including some players. 2 first and 2 seconds were included in there. The Watson trade from Houston to Cleveland, 6 picks, 3 firsts. Stafford going from Detroit to LA with Goff going back, still took 3 picks. 2 of them were firsts. And they got Jared Goff, who is arguably a franchise quarterback. He almost just made the Super Bowl, which would have been his second of his career. That's how valuable actual winning franchise quarterbacks are. You need a lot of picks. You can't trade him for a wide receiver when you don't have one. And right now, the Steelers need to see if they do with Wilson or Fields. The third option is you bring in a free agent. And likely this season, next offseason, it'll be Dak Prescott potentially available. That's going to cost you $50+ million a year. We saw Kirk Cousins, massive contract. That's pretty much $100 million in the first 2 years with Atlanta, just for them to also draft a quarterback. That's how important it is. I don't think it was a good decision by them to draft Michael Penix in the top 10, but that's how valuable these guys are. So you can't lock in a big wide receiver extension, which you need to sign Ayuk to get the trade worked out, because if you don't, you have the same problem the 49ers do where Ayuk doesn't want to play for you. And if you do, then you take one of those 3 options off the table. And I don't love Dak Prescott. He'd be a massive upgrade. He'd be the best quarterback playing in Pittsburgh since 2018 when Ben was still healthy before his elbow gave out. And that's pretty much indisputable. The other reason that the Steelers don't need to trade for a wide receiver, which was the number 3 item, and now we'll go to the number 4, Roman Wilson can be good right away. There's no reason, just because he's a 3rd-round wide receiver, that he has to wait, that we have to be patient with him. Mike Tomlin likes to do that with his rookies. He likes to ease them into the NFL game. And there's some value to that. I don't know that it's that valuable at the wide receiver position. Wide receivers are good right away. That is one pro of the passing boom in football. And it's systemic all the way down because these guys are playing 7-on-7 all summer and these camps where they don't want to put extra wear and tear on their body hitting, but the quarterbacks and the wide receivers get a ton of reps. And no one wants to play running back anymore because they don't get paid in the NFL. So those guys become wide receivers. And it just adds to the talent pool. And we see great mid-round wide receivers be great in their rookie year every season. Let's just look at 2023. Puka Nacua set the rookie receiving record. He was a 5th-round pick, 1,486 yards. Now, that's not something you can bank on, but it's an example that helps my argument. Second in rookie receiving yards last year was Rashee Rice, a late 2nd-rounder, 938 yards. He was catching passes from Patrick Mahomes. That's not going to be the case in Pittsburgh. It still helps my argument. Jordan Addison was a 1st-round pick. Sam Laporta, Zay Flowers was a 1st-round pick. Laporta was a tight end. That's why I don't really mention him the same way as these others. Then Jaden Reed, 793 yards in Green Bay, a late 2nd-round pick. Josh Downs with Washington, 771 yards, a 3rd-round pick. Tank Dell, arguably one of the best rookie wide receivers and one of the better young receivers in the NFL, 709 yards before he got injured, 3rd-round pick. 13 rookies had over 500 receiving yards last season, and only 4 of them were first-round picks. That includes Dalton Kincaid, who was a tight end, a first-rounder to the Bills. You don't need to draft these guys in the first round. That's something the Steelers have done really well. And you also don't need to wait a long time for them to be productive. Roman Wilson can be good immediately in Pittsburgh. And that's another reason the Steelers don't need to trade for a wide receiver. And now that brings us to number 5. And it's kind of serendipitous. It flows right in one into the other. The Steelers could get a really big boost from the 2023 draft class because Mike Tomlin was so patient with those guys last year. And I'm not saying they'll be better in their second year because they didn't play early. I'm just saying they didn't reap the full benefits of how talented that draft class was because they weren't playing early in the season. And I think Keanu Benton will be the best interior defensive lineman for the Steelers in 2024. This is a little prediction. We'll have a prediction show before the season, of course. This is a little bonus early prediction from me that, kind of gets into this point in this offseason six-pack. Cam Hayward's getting a lot older. He's coming off an injury. Larry Ogunjobi is often injured. Benton was a dominant force in limited reps last year on the interior. He had a great pass rush win rate. My apologies. I got nervous to even say it to Steelers fans because I know that's heresy to bring up pass rush win rate. But he had a great one, especially on true passing downs, which is important for a primarily a run defending interior lineman. He did well when the offensive line knew he was coming after them and he knew they were passing. He still got to the quarterback. I think he had 24 pressures on the season. That's a good number for a rotational defensive lineman who's a rookie. I loved Benton coming out of Wisconsin. There's no reason not to love him. And there's no reason not to expect a big boost in performance in his second season. There's no reason not to expect that from a lot of the 2023 NFL draft class for the Steelers. And I feel like we're underrating that group because we saw them last year, but we didn't see them in full-on roles until later in the year. Once Joey Porter Jr. got out there, he was fantastic. And a lot of people think he's going to be fantastic going forward. Broderick Jones, more mixed results because they moved him around on the line. It seems like they're going to move him back to the left side where he's more comfortable. We'll see what happens with that. But a full year in the NFL, he'll be a much better player. Joey Porter Jr. should be an even better player. Keanu Benton will be better. Darnell Washington could even take a step forward in the passing game. He was a good blocker because he's a massive extra offensive lineman out there. And I assume that Arthur Smith will have really creative ways to use him in both the run and the pass game. That's not even mentioning Nick Herbig, who I loved coming off the edge, who had the best pass rush win rate among Pittsburgh Steelers last year, and will get more opportunities, will be that third edge rusher instead of Marcus Golden, who was kind of getting snaps ahead of Herbig, which was endlessly frustrating for me last year, even though Golden was very good in that role. I just wanted to see the young guy out there. Maybe even Corey Trice Jr. will factor in some after coming off of that devastating knee injury that cost him his rookie season. Who knows with him, but that's a really good group of players that we know 5 of them are NFL players. That does not happen in every draft. You don't get 5 NFL starting caliber players in every draft. That's a huge rarity. And it looks like something the Steelers might have done. And this brings me to like the overly optimistic outlook that I secretly hold in the back of my head for the Steelers in 2024. This is my rose-colored glasses view of this team. It's not what I truly believe will happen. I believe they'll be mostly mediocre, struggle with quarterback play, and probably miss the playoffs, but maybe sneak in and lose in the first round. The reason to believe that maybe they'll take a massive leap or even a significant step forward is that draft class and its impact in its second year. So if you look at one of the best draft classes, best team drafts of the last decade or so, maybe even longer than that, because it was a really good draft class. It was the Saints in 2017. I'm not saying the Steelers class will be that, but it could be some version of it, some lesser version of it, I'll say. The Saints went 7-9 in 2016. And then after adding Marshawn Lattimore, Ryan Ramczyk, Marcus Williams, Alvin Kamara, Alex Anzalone, and Trey Hendrickson, all very, very good players. And I don't think all the Steelers will be that good. In 2017, the Saints went 11-5. So a little bit of improvement. A lot of that was Kamara based because he was excellent in his rookie year. And then as those guys really grew into their roles, 13-3 in 2018, 13-3 in 2019, and 12-4 in 2020. And that's with an aging Drew Brees who was really falling off of a cliff in a significant way. They were able to counteract that decline with these young players who carried the franchise. And the Steelers don't have the same exact type of decline, right? This would have been more applicable in maybe 2019, 2020 when Ben was on his downslope, but they have poor quarterback play relative to the other contenders in the NFL. Maybe that draft class can offset it. Maybe that draft class in the 2023 group can turn the Steelers into a second tier AFC contender. Not on the level of the Chiefs or even the Bills, who could maybe take a step back, or the Ravens, but somewhere in that next group. I think it's possible because I really like the talent in that class. I like the way they came along in their first year. It's probably not as good, but you got a starting offensive tackle, a starting cornerback, a starting interior defensive lineman, a contributing tight end who is kind of this weird X factor, extra blocker, and an interesting edge rusher in Herbig who would play a bigger role on a lot of other teams in the NFL. But the Steelers have TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith, so maybe they can do some more interesting things with three edges like the Browns did with Jim Schwartz last year that really helped them. It's possible. And that's my extra positive outlook that I don't always give on the Steelers because it scares me to, let myself get hurt potentially by, giving my optimistic look. But there it is. And if you're optimistic about the Steelers, if you're a big Steelers fan, if you love Steelers football and would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. I'm sure you're watching there right now. If you're listening to this later in podcast form, go to the YouTube, subscribe to the Still Curtain podcast. We really appreciate your support. And now that brings us to the final offseason thought. Number 6 in our 6-pack. Hopefully it looks more like Justin Fields' 6-pack than Russell Wilson's because, a little shaky. How long could Mike Tomlin realistically coach? He got another contract extension, and I broke that down. If you want to hear my thoughts more on that, go back to that episode because I reacted to it almost immediately after it was announced. But now we're getting into not unprecedented territory, but some pretty rarefied air for Tomlin's tenure in Pittsburgh in terms of just longevity. Think what you will about him and the team's inability to win in the playoffs, but Tomlin's been one of the better coaches in the NFL for a very long time. How long could that realistically go? And if you aren't a Tomlin believer, how long could you be trapped with him? If you are, how long could this team be guided by him? Hopefully to new heights. He's 17 years in at 52 years old, and he just signed an extension through the 2027 season. That would be 21 years with the team. Chuck Noll coached for 23 seasons from 1969 to 91, which sounds like a staggering amount of time to go from the 60s to the 90s, 23 years. Tomlin only needs one more small extension to equal that. And we pretty much know that if he wants it, he's going to get it. Because if their performance in the last few years wasn't enough for the Rooneys to reconsider, then I can't imagine anything that happens without a real franchise quarterback in the next 3 years, 4 years, will change their mind. There's really no way the Rooneys ever fire Mike Tomlin. He'll have to leave on his own. And I don't know that he's going to, at least not for a long time. Tomlin is at 180 wins in his career. That's 15th all time. One behind Pete Carroll. So he'll pass Pete this year. This season, just 9 wins, another 9-win season. He passed Carroll, Tom Coughlin, and Bill Parcells on the all-time list. With 9 wins a season through 2027, that extension, he would be at 216. That would be 8th all-time with Chuck Noll in the rearview mirror at 209 wins. And the 3 coaches in front of Tomlin would be Tom Landry in 5th, Curly Lambeau in 6th, and Paul Brown in 7th. Absolute legends of the game. And it's totally realistic that Tomlin, by the end of this extension, will be amongst that group. Just as an exercise, because it's not likely to happen, Tomlin would need 18 and a half more seasons at a 9-win pace to catch Don Shula at 347. That doesn't sound like realistic or possible at all, and it probably isn't. But he'd only be 70 at that point. And last season, both Carroll and Belichick were coaching in their 70s. And Andy Reid looks poised to do it. He's 66, the oldest coach in the NFL. At 52, Tomlin's not really, he's one of the elder statesmen by tenure. He is the elder statesman by tenure, ahead of Harbaugh by a year with 17 seasons in the same place. Reid's coached longer as a head coach, but in 2 different places. It's not unfathomable. It's not unbelievable. Lanny Fratteri would tell us nothing's unbelievable. It's not unbelievable that Tomlin could creep into that territory. Now, he's not going to be the winningest coach of all time. Probably not. But this is serious longevity, and it seems like it's not slowing down or stopping anytime soon. So how long could Tomlin really coach? I don't know, but it seems like he's going to be top 10 on the all-time wins list, a guaranteed Hall of Famer, whether he gets another Super Bowl ring or not. And those were at 9-win paces, which seems to be the floor. He could exceed that, win 10 games, 12 games a year, 11, 12, and that would expedite his progression up the all-time list. He only needs to coach for 6 more seasons to equal Noll and Steve Owen for the 4th longest tenure in NFL history, and he wouldn't even be 60 at that point. So whether you like Tomlin or not, it seems like he's going to be around for a really, really long time. And historically, that's pretty cool. If there aren't a lot more playoff wins that come along with it, it's not going to be all that fun along the ride. That's the offseason 6-pack of my thoughts. I'm Josh Yourish. Thank you so much for listening to the Still Curtain podcast. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you subscribe. Tell your friends about it. We're getting ready for the season. We're ramping things up, and it's going to be an exciting season of Steelers football and an exciting year on the Still Curtain podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.